Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My sister Emily didn't even call me. She sent a text on a Wednesday afternoon, a short little message with no greeting and no signature, just a flat statement that I was too emotionally draining to invite for Christmas this year, and that it would be better for everyone if I just took care of myself instead of showing up. I read it 3 times, sitting at my desk with my half-cold coffee, staring at the words that carried all the weight of a dismissal letter from someone who thought she had the power to decide my worth. At first, I laughed, but it was that kind of laugh that isn't funny at all, the kind that feels like it splits something inside of you. I had always been the one who paid for the insurance coverage Emily's family used without ever asking questions, the one who made sure her kids had tuition covered when deadlines came up faster than she could keep track of, the one who put money on the table when our parents had emergencies they couldn't handle. And yet, in her eyes, my value was negative, just draining. I sat with that word for a while, rolling it around in my head like a sharp piece of glass I couldn't spit out. Draining. What exactly did I drain from her? Her patience, her peace, her carefully curated image of being the golden daughter who had it all together? Because if we were being honest, she never could have afforded the house she lived in without me stepping in on the back end, smoothing over gaps with payments nobody saw. She never could have sent her oldest son to that private school without me setting up the account that quietly transferred tuition. And yet, to the world, she was the successful mother with everything balanced perfectly, while I was the fragile sister she had to manage, the one she claimed struggled with boundaries whenever she wanted to excuse her cruelty. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the Christmas decorations that had been boxed up in my closet since last year. I hadn't even bothered unpacking them this time. I thought about how many Christmases I had spent quietly buying the expensive gifts our parents couldn't, letting them put their names on the tags because it made them feel better. I thought about the Christmas Eve I had stayed up past midnight on the phone with Emily, talking her through her panic about bills, while she sat by the tree her kids thought Santa had magically made appear. And now she had reduced me to a liability, someone to be cut out like a rotten branch. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but instead, I felt something colder, heavier, and sharper than sadness. I felt clarity. If I was too emotionally draining to sit at her table, then maybe she was too financially dependent to sit comfortably in her life without me. I opened my laptop, logged into the health insurance account that carried not just my coverage, but hers and her family's, and I hovered for a moment over the button that would remove them. My hands didn't even shake. I clicked it, confirmed it, and in less than 5 minutes the safety net she never acknowledged was gone. It was late when the first message came through. Emily's husband, Mark, texted me directly, his words rushed and panicked. He asked if there was some kind of mistake, because the hospital had called about a procedure he was scheduled for, saying coverage had been denied. I stared at the screen, letting the messages pile up one after another, each more frantic than the last. I could almost hear his voice cracking as he typed. And I thought to myself, this is what it feels like to stop being invisible. By morning, Emily herself had called 6 times. She left voicemails that swung wildly from furious to pleading, like she couldn't decide which version of herself might get through to me. In one, she shouted about how irresponsible and cruel I was being, and in another, she sobbed, saying her kids didn't deserve to suffer for her issues. The irony wasn't lost on me. Apparently, it was perfectly acceptable for me to suffer alone year after year, carrying responsibilities no one wanted to admit I shouldered, but the second I stopped, suddenly I was the villain tearing apart innocent lives. I didn't respond to a single call or text. I made coffee, went to work, and carried on as if nothing had changed, because in truth nothing had changed except that for the first time, they were seeing what my absence looked like. They called it punishment. I called it reality. That evening, after ignoring my phone the entire day, I finally picked it up to silence the constant buzzing, and that was when I noticed Emily's last message, shorter than the others, the words typed in a shaky rhythm I knew too well. What else are you going to do? I stared at the question, my finger hovering over the screen. She wanted to know if I was finished, if cutting the insurance was the full extent of my retaliation, or if I had more in me. I didn't answer her, but I knew the truth already. I wasn't even close to finished. The day after Emily's string of calls and whiplash voicemails, I woke up with the strange lightness that follows a storm you didn't know you'd been living under for years, and as I stood in my kitchen stirring coffee that tasted like resolve more than caffeine, I realized how many parts of their lives were stitched together with threads I had supplied quietly and consistently, which meant I knew exactly where the seams were and how to tug them without tearing the fabric beyond repair, just enough to make the wear visible to the people who had pretended not to notice. I took my laptop to the dining table I rarely used for anything except paying bills and filling out forms nobody thanked me for, and I opened the education account I had set up when Emily's oldest started kindergarten. The one that had been politely labeled with his initials so it would feel like a family contribution rather than the lifeline it really was, and I checked the next tuition installment date, the activity log. That showed my transfers landing like clockwork and the school's bursar information I had saved because the office manager once told me, with genuine warmth, that it was rare to work with someone so organized. I dialed the bursar and, in that carefully calm voice I use when I do not want to be argued with, I explained that I was the funding source, not a cosigner or a sentimental aunt with a holiday envelope, and that I needed the payment plan paused while we reviewed eligibility, knowing full well that eligibility was a polite word for relationship, and that relationships have consequences even when everyone pretends they do not. The woman on the line hesitated, searching for the right professional phrasing, then said she would mark the account pending and flag it to the financial aid committee in case documentation was required, and I thanked her the way I always do. Because none of this was her fault, and because politeness is a useful instrument when you are doing something that will be perceived as cruel by people who benefited from your softness for too long. Before I ended the call, I asked for written confirmation, and when the email arrived, I filed it neatly into the folder labeled Family, a small act that made me laugh because the label had always meant obligation, not togetherness. By mid-morning, the family group chat that I have muted for years lit up like a faulty string of lights, and even though I had promised myself I wouldn't look, I glanced anyway and saw the script unfold exactly as predicted. Emily accusing me of punishing children because I couldn't handle adult conversations, Mark chiming in with awkward righteousness about community and support, a couple of cousins offering bland peacekeeping lines about the holidays being a hard time for everyone, and then my mother appearing with a voice that tries to sound gentle while pushing with both hands, asking if I could please stop making statements and remember that the boys had done nothing wrong. I typed nothing, because saying nothing is a language they never bothered to learn, and I let the chat climb toward that fevered place where people start to rewrite history in real time, and where the person who funded the quiet is recast as the person who loves conflict. Mark tried calling while I was at my desk, and when I didn't answer, he sent a voice memo that began with the phrase, "Look, we're all family," which set off a heat in my ribs because family had always been the word they used when they wanted something from me without admitting it was a request, and the memo ended with a warning that the school would not hold a place if payments went missing, which was precisely the point, not to end a child's education, but to force the adult who claimed I was too heavy to sit at her table to notice that the table had been propped up on my hands. I blocked his number before the second memo arrived, not because I am petty, but because the drama of men who never checked a balance until it hurt is not a story I have time to carry anymore. In the late afternoon, when the winter light had already folded itself into a gray strip along my living room wall, my phone pinged with a voicemail from my mother that made me pause halfway between the couch and the window, because her tone had slipped from guilt-laced pleading into something tighter, almost fearful, and she spoke in rushed sentences about how this had gone too far and how she understood that my feelings were valid, but surely I could separate my hurt from the practical necessities of life. And then she added a detail she must have thought would hook me, that the school had contacted Emily about a pending hold and that the boys were crying because they didn't understand, and I stood there holding the phone like a fragile relic and thought, For the first time, that my mother's fear wasn't about the boys or even about Emily, it was about the realization spreading through the family that I had never been fragile at all. I had been powerful, and they had misread power as need because it served them. I spent the evening doing what they always insisted I couldn't do, which was live as if my life didn't orbit theirs, and I cooked something simple, answered work emails, folded laundry, and felt the steady pulse of a boundary finally holding. And when the group chat surged again with a frenzy of opinions, I went one better than ignoring it. I exited the chat and blocked every single number that had decided my sanity was a debate topic, because if they wanted the benefits of my presence, they could start by feeling the absence with the clarity I had been forced to learn. As a final act before bed, because revenge is only satisfying when it is also meticulous, I logged back into the education portal and revoked the automatic disbursement authorization so that nothing could slip out while I slept. And as I closed the laptop, I saw a notification bloom on my screen from a social platform I rarely open anymore, tagged with my name and my mother's, and the preview line showed the first sentence of a post that began, "I never thought I'd have to say this about my own daughter," and I knew, with a cold certainty that felt almost like peace, that tomorrow would not be quiet. By morning, the post had gathered a predictable bouquet of comments from women my mother knows from church and neighbors who believed they had a stake in our family narrative because they once borrowed a ladder or shared a casserole at a memorial. And as I scrolled through the thread that named me without tagging me, a practiced performance of maternal heartbreak composed in gentle sentences and passive images, I noticed how quickly strangers felt entitled to my reputation, how easily an audience will cast a daughter as ungrateful if the mother summons tears, and I realized with a steadiness that surprised even me that this was not grief, it was choreography, the same old routine where I am supposed to show up, absorb the public scolding as a lesson in humility, pay the bill, and leave quietly before dessert is served. I clicked through the photos she had attached, pictures of Christmases past where I was a ghost at the edge of the frame, or the person behind the camera, arms that never made it into the shot because they were busy carrying trays in debt, and I felt that old, sour sting of invisibility, then watched it dissolve into something clearer and far less sentimental, because if they are going to pull the curtain back, then I am allowed to light the stage. What nobody on that thread knew, and what my family had pretended to forget because amnesia is convenient when generosity becomes routine, was that my parents' retirement sits on a stack of numbers that looks decent only because I kept spackling the cracks with automatic transfers and emergency advances that were documented in my spreadsheet but never acknowledged in conversation. Which meant that when my mother wrote about losing our safety, she was not wrong, she just left out the author. And when she wrote that she did not know how they would afford the medication my father takes, she neglected to mention that the discount card was registered under my employer account and that the refill reminders came to my email first. I did not want to be cruel, but I was done being the cashier at a store that everyone swore was self-checkout, so I opened my banking app and pulled up the list of standing orders that flowed out on the first of each month like dutiful soldiers, and I stared at the ones labeled utilities, HOA, and pharmacy supplement, labeling them in my mind the same way I would label a recurring stress stream, and then, with a measured breath, I paused them, not deleted because I still have a conscience and a sense of proportion, but paused so that the rhythm would stumble and the silence would be instructive, because sometimes the only way to teach grown adults the physics of support is to remove the invisible beam and let them hear the house groan. I told myself I would give it a week, that if my mother called me directly and spoke to me like a daughter and not an audience, I would reinstate the pharmacy line immediately and maybe even the utilities. Because I am not a monster and because winter has a way of making even justified boundaries feel too sharp. But instead of a call, I received a forwarded email from a cousin, kindly framed as "just so you know," which revealed that Emily had been building the case against me for years at family gatherings. I skipped to preserve my sanity, telling anyone who would listen that my help always came with strings, that I liked to keep people dependent so I could feel powerful, that I used words like budget as traps. And I almost laughed from the exhausted absurdity of it, because the strings she described had names like deadline and interest rate and copay. And the only time I had ever invoked them was to stop her from signing something reckless while she was busy curating a life where consequences were for other people. I made tea, not because I needed comfort, but because the ritual of heat and steam gave my hands something to do while my mind arranged its pieces, and I thought about the time she told me, with a smug kindness that still makes my jaw tighten, that I needed therapy to learn how to be less intense, as if intensity were not the exact engine that kept her from selling her car during that long summer when Mark's contract fell through, and the thought arrived, cool and clean as a winter star, that maybe Emily had always understood the power dynamic perfectly and had been working to flip the story before anyone else noticed it, which would explain why she seemed so shocked, not that I cut the insurance, but that I finally admitted out loud what I had been doing in silence. I called the pharmacy to confirm the refill schedule and asked the technician, who knows me by voice at this point, to place a note on the account that any pickup required card payment at the counter, a small administrative change that would not deny my father his medication, but would remove the illusion that prescriptions materialize out of love rather than money. And when she said, of course, in that efficient tone that always comforts me, I thanked her and felt a flicker of guilt for dragging strangers into this theater, then reminded myself that the theater had been announced to the internet without my consent. By early evening, a new post appeared, this time on a community group page my mother frequents for recipes and recommendations, where she wrote that she was praying for reconciliation and that sometimes daughters make choices mothers do not understand. And the comments swelled with a chorus of moral advice that made my skin prickle, because nothing invites the righteous like a family rift with a whiff of money, and I remembered every time I had been told to be the bigger person by people who never had to lift what I was lifting, and I decided that if I was going to be big, then I would be big on purpose, with clarity and receipts. I composed a short message to my mother, not a manifesto, just a single paragraph that said I would speak with her in person when she took down the posts and agreed to leave my name out of future online performances, and I pressed send, watched it deliver, and put my phone face down on the table like a gambler who knows the card he needs is already in the deck for the night's revenge, because each day deserved a final, precise stroke that moved the story toward accountability rather than spectacle. I logged into the household autopay platform I had set up after their late fee fiasco last spring, and I changed the primary payer from my account to an inactive placeholder that would trigger a gentle but undeniable failure notice on the due date. Then I drafted a tidy email to both my parents outlining the utilities, the amounts, the dates, and the instructions to re-establish payment in their own names, an email whose tone was so calm it felt like a reprimand, and I scheduled it to send at dawn, when coffee is sharp and excuses sound thin. When I finally turned my phone over again, a notification pulsed from a name I had muted and unmuted more times than I could count, and the preview line, stark against the screen's glow, read, "If you want to play this game, I have things I can say too," which would have been laughable if it hadn't been. Followed by a second notification from the community group, "Emily has added a comment under your mother's post," a comment I could not yet see because the page had just refreshed, and for a long minute I watched the spinning circle load like a fuse being lit, knowing that whatever she had written, it would not be the truth I recognized, and knowing also that my next move would require something sharper than silence. When I finally read Emily's comment under my mother's post, it wasn't a direct accusation, but a carefully crafted piece of theater, designed to sting me without sounding overtly cruel. A performance for the onlookers that painted her as noble and me as unstable, a balancing act she had perfected over the years while leaning heavily on the scaffolding I had built in silence. She wrote that she had always tried to love me despite my difficult nature, that family sometimes needed to create distance for their own health, and that while it broke her heart, she hoped one day I would understand what boundaries meant. The words dripped with that sanctimonious tone she wears like perfume, the kind of tone that cloaks cruelty in concern and leaves the target looking unreasonable if they dare to respond with anger. I could feel the comments lining up beneath her performance, the predictable applause for her strength and honesty, and I knew if I said anything in haste it would be ammunition she had been waiting to use for years. so I didn't rush. I let the post sit open on my screen while I prepared dinner, folding my irritation into the slow rhythm of chopping onions and boiling pasta, and by the time I sat down to eat, I had decided on something simple, elegant, and devastating in its restraint. I would not argue with her about who had been the responsible one, or list the countless times my so-called difficult nature had taken the form of bank transfers and signatures that kept her children in school and her household insured. Instead, I would drop a single pebble into the pond and let the ripples find their way. Under my mother's post, below Emily's sermon about my emotional unworthiness, I typed one short line: "You should ask Emily why I was never good enough to sit at the Christmas table." I didn't defend myself, didn't elaborate, didn't offer a story. I simply left the implication hanging, a shadow over her spotless image, a question that would fester in the minds of those who read it. And then, before she or my mother could rush in with explanations or counterattacks, I deleted my account, erasing myself from the very stage they had chosen for their spectacle. The next day, when I arrived at my office, Emily was waiting, red-faced and furious, her voice rising before I had even set down my bag. She demanded to know what I thought I was doing, how I could humiliate her like that, and whether I realized what people were now saying to her, the whispers she couldn't control. I listened calmly, because anger was her chosen weapon and silence was mine, and when she finally stopped to breathe, I smiled the kind of smile that isn't warm at all and told her, "That depends." The look on her face was almost worth every year of being invisible. Throughout that week, my phone buzzed with a mixture of blocked attempts to reach me, secondhand reports through colleagues who knew someone who knew my family, and anonymous messages that arrived in the vague language of moral policing, urging me to reconcile because life is too short and family is everything. What none of them seemed to grasp was that family had been everything to me, but I had been nothing to them except a source of stability they assumed would never dry up. By taking away their safety nets, I wasn't destroying them. I was simply letting them live in the same precarious reality I had occupied for years while they toasted themselves over holiday dinners I wasn't invited to. The strangest part was the relief I felt once my name disappeared from their online stage. Without a digital record to defend or a thread of comments to correct, I was finally free to let the silence speak for itself. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was scrambling to patch leaks before anyone noticed the water rising. Instead, I could watch them scramble, watch them taste the consequences of believing their comfort was guaranteed. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment with the faint glow of the city through my blinds, I thought about how revenge doesn't always have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to keep absorbing blows while handing out gifts. I thought about my mother's face, wet with tears in those photos she had posted, and how her words had carried the desperate weight of someone who wasn't just mourning a daughter's distance, but also mourning the collapse of the story she had spun for the world. The story where she was the suffering matriarch holding a fractured family together. In reality, she had been carried too, she just never admitted it, and now that the carrying had stopped, she was forced to wobble in full view of her friends and neighbors. I poured myself a glass of wine, the same way I had the night I read Emily's first cruel text, and I let the quiet fill my apartment. For once, the quiet felt like choice, not exile. Yet, even as I relished the stillness, I knew it wouldn't last. Families like mine don't surrender their narratives easily, and people like Emily never let a spotlight slip without grabbing at it with both hands. So when my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number, just a single word enough, I felt a shiver of anticipation rather than fear, because if this was her idea of drawing the line, then she still hadn't realized that I was the one who had already erased the chalk. The message that said only enough became the spark I had been expecting, not because it was particularly threatening or clever, but because it revealed the desperation beneath Emily's composure, the thin crack in her armor that she had always tried to hide behind sarcasm and moral superiority, and it told me with a clarity I could taste that she had finally reached the place where her words could no longer patch the holes left by her actions. I didn't reply, of course, because I had no interest in engaging on her terms, but the word lingered in my mind as I drove to work, as I sat through meetings, and as I watched the afternoon light shift across my office wall. And it pressed against me like a reminder that the story was not finished, that we were still circling each other in a contest neither of us wanted to concede. That evening Emily appeared again, not at my office this time, but outside my apartment building. Her car pulled into the loading zone with her hazard lights flashing like a beacon of stubbornness. And when I came down the steps, she stepped in front of me with that mixture of fury and desperation that makes people unpredictable. Her voice wavered as she told me the boys had been crying every night since the tuition notice arrived, that Mark's surgery had been postponed indefinitely, that our mother had stopped sleeping because she was convinced she had failed us both. And for the first time, she didn't sound like she was performing for an audience. She sounded like someone drowning who had just realized the person holding the lifeline wasn't going to throw it without conditions. I listened, because silence has always been my sharpest tool, and when she finished, I told her in one long, deliberate breath that she had created this collapse with her own arrogance, that I had carried them quietly for years and asked for nothing but a seat at the table, and that when she decided I was unworthy of even that, she had effectively told me my contributions were meaningless, so I had given her exactly what she asked for, a life without me. Her eyes darted like a cornered animal, and she accused me of being vindictive, of punishing children for adult conflicts, of trying to rewrite history by pretending I had never wanted to be part of the family anyway. I let her words spill into the cold night air, and when she finally paused for breath, I answered with the truth that cut sharper than any insult. Vindictive? No. I just stopped paying the bill. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been, because she knew in that instant that her power had always been borrowed, and the lender had finally called in the debt. The following days blurred with smaller skirmishes, my mother sending carefully worded emails that tried to bridge the gap while still painting herself as the mediator rather than the participant. Distant relatives forwarding me scripture verses as though Bible quotes could settle overdue balances, and even an old neighbor writing to say she was praying for me, though she hadn't spoken to me in a decade. But the act that finally anchored everything came late at night when I scrolled through my feed and found my mother's newest post, a photograph of the family gathered around a glowing Christmas tree, Emily in the center with her boys and Mark at her side. And the caption beneath written in my mother's unmistakable cadence, "We are still together, no matter what." There was no mention of me, no apology, no plea this time, only a public declaration that they were whole without me, that they had sealed the crack I had left by papering it over with defiance. I stared at the photo longer than I should have, examining the forced smiles, the way Emily's hand gripped her son's shoulder a little too tightly, the absence in my mother's eyes that no caption could disguise, and I felt a strange cocktail of triumph and sorrow. They had tried to erase me, and in their attempt to prove I was unnecessary, they had only confirmed how central I had been all along, but the cost of that confirmation was steep, because I knew in that moment that even if I reinstated every payment tomorrow, even if I dialed every office and smoothed every wrinkle back into place, nothing would ever return to what it was before. I closed my laptop and sat in the dim quiet of my living room, a glass of wine untouched on the table, and let the thought settle that revenge had given me clarity, but not comfort, that power had given me space, but not peace. The choice sat before me, sharp and waiting. I could make a single call and rebuild the scaffolding they pretended had never been there, or I could let the silence stand and watch them wobble until they learned to build something of their own. I didn't decide that night. I simply leaned back, exhaled into the shadows, and let the ambiguity breathe, because sometimes the most satisfying ending is not a final blow, but the unresolved question that lingers in the air long after the curtain has fallen. And as I drifted toward sleep, I knew with absolute certainty that my mother would post again, that Emily would circle again, that the begging and the blaming would never truly stop, but whether I would answer, that secret belonged to me alone.